Okay, here's a new vid about people that showed up at the Cosmic Summit. If you're not aware, it's people that are kind of into this stuff that like quite a bit of things that I talk about, ancient times or Atlantis or things like that. And so they'll have professional people and people that are in the know writing books and things like that come on to the Cosmic Summit. They have other ones that have different names each year, and they're posted around in major cities and stuff so people can come and visit them. This was done by Martin B. Sweatman, and this paper here was one that he did back in 2017, decoding Gobekli Tepe with archeoastronomy. What does the fox say? That'll come into play whenever we start talking about the fox symbology that they show here in the ancient zodiac, which this guy makes a connection actually to the eventual Greek zodiac that we all know so well, and so on. But of course, that's taken from the Wayback Machine, and even though it's still a person like Orion and things like that, they had different connections back in the Wayback Machine before things like that happened. He was even on a episode of Forbidden History, Secrets of Gobekli Tepe, talking about that face that's there is in with that enclosure that has 11 other pillars that are inside it, him making the 12th and so on. So it's a pretty incredible information that this guy starts putting together with archaeoastronomy and symbolism and what that means and calendars, to the point it gets to the point where he's figured out their calendar and the dating that goes along with it and what they're trying to pinpoint with this Pillar 43 that everybody should be familiar with in Gobekli Tepe. It's like if you look up Gobekli Tepe, you're going to see a couple of Stonehenge-like rings and then close-up pictures of some of these pillars with archaeoastronomy and zodiacal type things written onto them. He himself, in his conversation here, goes into the idea that this archaeoastronomy or this zodiac type thing that they're showing probably goes back well over 50,000 years and continues from there. In fact, he'll show you eventually Lascaux Cave and a few other connections in the videos that I made. So this is a very affirming video for me in making other connections that I didn't know and connections about Gobekli Tepe. Over here on the left, this man is wearing a fox for his papoose type of thing that he has going on, or his sash that goes on, and that is supposed to be hooked up to the younger Dryas related comet that goes on. And there's stories about the fire fox that sets ablaze the world and so on like that. So there are connections here that we could talk about and go on, but there's that H pillar mark that's right above my pointer, and hopefully you can see here. And then he's got his hands around his belly, like we've seen in so many sites all over the world, from Easter Island to all kinds of places. But on the right here, it shows the path of the Taurids, or the path of the idea of where that may have come from whenever they saw it come in, because it shows Taurus, which is hooked up with the Pleiades as his shoulder, to be the emanation point of the Taurid meteor shower, which we're getting close to Halloween here. So right around then, that's the time of the witches' brooms and Day of the Dead and all this type of thing. Well, it looks like here they have a symbology figured out that might say that they're pinpointing these Taurids as being the Day of the Dead from that, in memoriam from what happened not too long before this with the younger Dryas comet event and how so many people had died. It's pretty incredible. But this pillar that's here is pretty well known, and it's got that symbology of a vulture holding the sun and so on like that. But this scribble that I talked about recently as being something that is right up here in this gap, and why didn't it fill in all the way? And if they had it painted like in a video I just did day before yesterday, why didn't they signify it out? Well, they might find that they did. But what this man has found is the upper epsilon and lower epsilons are ups and downs of this graphic pattern here is something that they've seen before, notching out a lunar month. And then he shows that they have a 12 lunar months, and then a certain amount of days above that point for the Earth to cycle. So they already had connections to the days of the solstice when the year actually turns around to an accurate point here. Only thing is, it comes out to 364 days. Well, the other V is right there on the vulture, which is the symbol of the dead, as I talked about from well before this time, where people were putting their bodies up on a dais and letting the birds eat it and go swirling up like a tornado, like when we see buzzards here in the Southwest, and you can always tell something died because they're all circling around an area. Of course, they eventually come down. Anyhow, so he's made connections to these things, and he's had other papers out, as I showed that one in 2017. But in that fact, he's actually got a new paper coming out now, and it's under peer review. So that's real interesting, and it's showing these new connections that he has that he thought he'd share with the audience here, which I think is fantastic. So let's try to get to the point here. Using these and other sites that are hooked up with the Gobekli Tepe idea in archeoastronomy, he can connect this directly to the Greek constellations eventually. And he shows that these handbags up here are actually versions of sunsets. And this depiction here is a bear. Well, he figured out it's like a bear skin rug. We'll get to that eventually. But then there's an ibex type creature here, and then a person looking thing that's over here. Well, these are the equinoxes and zodiacal points, just like he shows here, and how it hooks up to Pisces, it hooks up to Gemini, and Aquarius. And at the time, they didn't have Aquarius as a man with the water in a pitcher. They had a different connotation with it that hooks up to this fox. Anyhow, so there's other connections to that, and then there's also connections to Ophiuchus, the serpent man, with the idea of the master of beasts and so on, and I've talked about that in 3 or 4 other videos, and here's another confirmation where this is from somebody who actually does archeoastronomy. So it makes a lot of connections that we've been trying to make for a long period of time. And I'd like for you to watch these videos that they have here. You can look up the Cosmic Summit, and it'll just show you 2023, and it'll show you all the different people, and perhaps from then you can go back and look at the other ones that they had before that, different speakers, especially if it grabs your attention. But look at each one and look what they say about it. Maybe it might grab your attention. Well, they're saying that this cut off heads man down here in the bottom is a symbol of death. And that hooks up with this whole thing. So there's a ceremonial thing hooked up to this whole idea. In fact, in a recent video we show that there's a bear and a space portal situation that's there, or a boar, and it's painted too. So they believe a lot of this might have been totally painted, and just by the time of getting sandblasted from sitting there getting covered up and shaken every once in a while, it's really just flaked off most of it. Of course, one can imagine how good paint would be from that age, but so they have this younger dryas impact, and it seems to be correlated with that. And whenever he actually gets to the point here of figuring out the dating of everything that they're trying to show with this pillar and the Taurus thing that I showed you a minute ago, it comes out to, yeah, that's the dating that they get off of it. But there's also anonymous dates where it's showing like 9,450 in the pits that are there, and even in the cooking hearths and so on. But in actuality, you know, they didn't build this whole place and cook in it once. And so seeing the last remnants of something that they cooked in the hearth that at the end of everything doesn't show you its beginning or origins. But his calendar starts to point towards a date that would have said right around the Younger Dryas event, and these people making it almost as a memorial to him. Well, at least this enclosure that's here. Now, the thing that I showed you before was an enclosure of enclosure D, and once they've got that totally cleaned out, they had this man sitting there, these pillars and so on. So there's connections there, but then there's a portal to nowhere type of situation that looks like a big lifesaver, if you will, from a boat. And pretty crazy, all the connections that go on here. And again, this guy's got his newest thing coming out, making all these connections hooked up with it. and it's up for peer review now, and it's been in peer review for a while, so we can expect, hopefully in a very short amount of time, that it gets past its peer review point. You can see the crowd there that's up in the top right hand corner. In fact, that's him speaking there. But I do want you to go and look at this, and it's Gobekli Tepe and the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, Dr. Martin B. Sweatman, at the Cosmic Summit 2023. Get anywhere near that, you ought to find it or whatever here. So there's papers that have been out that are actually correlating and saying that this Younger Dryas impact happened and everything, and it's really covering almost half the world. In fact, not only did it hit on the North American ice shelf that goes on there and then spill out in the Carolina Bays and so on, but it looks like some might have hit actually in the ocean, and after they hit in the ocean, still carrying more pieces of it would have gone over into Europe and the areas that are around there. In fact, there's a tell that's there that people tried to equate to, maybe this is the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah, until they dated it and figured out, yeah, that's before that, but what happened there? Well, it's a bolide event equal to about 60 Hiroshima bombs, and it looked like it wasn't a one event, but something that broke into three pieces, kind of like that one that happened over in Russia here a couple of years ago, and in doing so, it blew up bow, 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 and overcast each other. I've got a video about that, but so he's going to show you different things here, and here's his list that we'll have to go through looking at it. But Paleolithic astronomy, constellations, and animal symbol myths. Number 3 is origin of Greek constellations. Number 4 is Gerstein's prediction, and this is an idea of looking back and how far it may go. But Gerstein, and he even mentions, made a mistake there, because he thought at that time that he was pushing the boundary, saying that around 6000 BC people started to make agriculture. In the 25 years from that point or whatever, we realized it goes back to this dating, and there's still a debate situation on whether or not it was going on just near Gobekli Tepe, or where's any sign of it. They're farming all around these things. Almost every one of these sites, which there are 14 sites, Gobekli Tepe isn't alone, Karahan Tepe, the other picture, or so on. Anyhow, then after that point, we're going to show a master of animals or master of beast concept that, of course, carries all the way through to Sumeria. And you can find the Gibel Arab knife in pre-dynastic Egypt showing up there, so we'll make connections with that too. The next one, number 6, is handbags are sunsets, or they equate to it, or the reason they're shaped it the way they were is because of so on. And then we'll talk about cattle hoyuk and bear shrines that are there, because we talked about the bear symbology that's on the post that's right by the handbags. People have seen this handbag idea and they've made all kinds of correlations to it, but the little right next to it are little small symbols to each one, and that designates it to being at which solstices and the symbols and when certain ceremonies were. So they were leaving a record of what they had going on at the time on these pillars, and that this had happened then. And then we'll talk about a lunisolar calendar, lunisolar, so it working off of the moon, but with the sun also at its apexes, and making one out of that. If this goes to part 2, and it definitely will, it's going to be in your top left-hand corner here. In fact, I don't know how much battery's left on this, but there's probably a short amount of time before it shows me a low deal and turns off this video, and I have to do a next one. So what we're looking at here is these South Anatolia area, and of course Catalhoyuk is right here, we'll talk about later, Gobekli Tepe, Abu Huraira, which is the site I told you about that got smacked by a bolide event and so on. But then other sites like Aleppo and Lebanon, Beirut, ancient Damascus, and so on, they show here. And of course, the Fertile Crescent's outlined by this. But this was the earliest empire known to man, and it shows up at the Younger Dryas event, and they buried this thing under and walked away from it to cause civilization apparently spread out all over the place. Going down here, you go through the Levant into North Africa, Egypt, and over into Yemen very easily. And going this way, you'll at first encounter ancient Sumer running all the way through, and then later points that are hooked up with Akkadians and so on. But if we kept going, there's also the ancient Indus Valley situation, and then India itself, which I've made other videos about and connections. So looking at these sites here and trying to make connections with archeoastronomy, this is looking south at one of their buildings that they looked at, and it looks like it got stripped by people in ancient times, and we're actually lucky that around it are still a lot of buried ruins, and they only took a part that actually got exposed. And they stole most of the T-pillars off of it, but then again, the sockles that those set in and so on are still showing to the point that you can make out where everything was, luckily. And what's up under that hill over there? Well, there's a lot of hills around here that have connections to it. So here's Gobekli Tepe in the way that it looks now, with all of its accoutrements hooked up to it. It's got a Pringles potato chip over the top of it and so on. And I think this is enclosure D too we're looking at. So once they finally got this all cleaned out, that's where they found the man that's there. And then it's got a vulture hooked up to it too, and then this portal stone to nowhere situation. It looks like it was a death shrine. So this is all looking like it makes connections to that. And there's ground penetrating radar that he's showing here that shows that there's a lot more big places all up under this that they haven't even started to dig out. And they are semicircular and so on. Looking at these things, there's all these pillars that are around it. There's 11 pillars here and 11 pillars there, and then other numbers for other buildings. And it looks like they use these for ceremonies. Well, we look at pillar D, or enclosure D, and that actually has that death symbology hooked up to it with the other video that I did off ancient architects just before this, so I should put it out not too much time after. But so there's 11 T-shaped pillars that are shown with this, and it's hooked up to the solstices and the directions of the lines, and where the T's are hooked up on the ground are giving direct correlation not to north but to true north, or magnetic north, and instead of north like it shows on the sign there, which is pretty neat. But each one of these signs that are showing here, again, look at all of this that's up under it here that they can see hasn't even been excavated yet. That's enclosure D, and it just got done. And it's only looking like it's 9600 BC, but isn't that, yeah, that's the Younger Dryas dating event that goes on. And so they're trying to find earlier ones and so on, and then just peg it off of this one. But we have a lot of the other sites, some of them predating these sites easily. So running through this time that's here, and then all of a sudden they decided together as a people to bury all of that and to go out and herald civilization, which they already apparently had going on to some extent, and carry it on to other people. It's funny, I've heard that before a few times in other stories. And here's a representation which looks like that's what's happening. In fact, as I said, he carries through a zodiac. But I made a recent video showing you that, well, the Dendera zodiac that everybody knows about is not the oldest. In fact, that's taken directly from the Sumerians, which goes back to over 5000 BC. In fact, he's going to talk about it here in a little bit. And whenever he does so, he makes connections from here to there. And then he acts like it's a given that people should understand that it goes from there and to the ancient Greeks. And then he shows connections. So enclosure E here that was exposed, is that older than enclosure D? Well, we'll probably never really know because they can't get dating out of that. I mean, it's rock, and they don't have any of the burnt stuff or the things that are buried. Again, we are so lucky that they buried this thing under at one time, and in doing so, it basically left them with an archaeological record and a perfect dating, not something that somebody came in later and did this and did that. Well, I think all of us can understand that if anybody came in a little later than this, that none of this would have been here. The only reason it is here is because it got buried under. So Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, all resources seem to be seasonal, he talks about. You ought to look at his whole presentation again, and I'll try to put a link to it down right there in the messages here. But it says that they're seasonal, and I made a recent video last year showing you that there are these dots that are right next to certain animals, and certain dots for certain animals and certain dots for others, and 4 right in front of cows and so on. What is this? Well, they figured out now that that's basing it on a yearly calendar that comes around the cycle of the sun at its farthest point, and then they're working off a lunar calendar other than that, and say you have to wait at least 4 moons after that before you try to kill this, because she's the mama and you don't want to take out the whole situation. So you've got to let it get past that point. Anyhow, I made a video about it. But he goes on into the idea that most of these resources, here he is again, are actually seasonal somewhat, and that these people did different things at different times of the year and set themselves up and so on, and they knew when things were going to happen, like there was going to be nuts on the trees and situations like that. So here we see a spear that actually has a weird dashing on the front of it, and it's got 15 dashes and crescents, and then crescents the other way, only 14. And that makes the connection to where that's a lunar calendar right there. Well, here's in Lascaux Cave here that I've shown before, and it's that thing about the animals with the 4 dots, and it's got the dots up here at the shoulder. Well, everybody knows that's the Pleiades, because that's what's right there. And the bullseye, and it's got dots building it out almost like it was a dot to dot, like when you're kids. But in front of the animal, it ends up showing you, whoops, these 4 dots that are right here. What does that have to do with it? Well, strangely, in all these different caves, they have this art. It shows 4 dots in front of all of those animals. And other animals have different amount of dots. Different things go along with them. So they could be talking about that. Here's another weird thing. He's going to show you here in a second that all these caves that have cave art in them are actually hooked up to where the sun makes a beam through the front of it, either on a solstice or a culmination point, or they really didn't use that cave. In fact, whenever you get into it, the ones that are lined up to something at least close enough within 3 degrees of being correct, so it could be the days before coming into it within a week, that they have the art that's drawn in them, and then the other ones that they know it's habitation doesn't have art in them. Another thing I have to mention here is that there really isn't that much habitation in these caves. If people are living in caves exclusively and blah, 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 there would be a whole lot more habitation. Stuff would be just piled up instead of showing you that there were times that people showed up and a few burials out of the tens of thousands of people that had probably gone to this cave for thousands of years at certain times to end up passing down this information and working in a ceremony. Now, here the top left circled one here is the decorated caves per azimuth. And what it shows is the highest peak is there on the right, and that's the summer sunset solstice, making it through the cave entrance straight through to where you see a light all the way down. In fact, Lascaux, they said, well, that's about 3 degrees off, but effectively it tilts down a hair and it makes it work, but it also works coming into and through the days. It's not like only on a certain day, but encompassing it on a week in either side or so on. And then of course the winter solstice is the next thing that it's hooked up to. But if you look at the undecorated caves that show some type of habitation and stuff in them, they don't have this azimuth situation. There's also a strange correlation with the side of the wall where they have these constellations. If that wall was totally see-through, that's what you'd see coming up in the sky, making its connection, almost like they were talking about it from inside towards outside. Pretty neat connections, huh? So let's continue here and get on, see how much I can get in before this thing tells me that I don't have any time left. Here's a viewpoint of the sun at the summer solstice setting point and where it goes into Lascaux Cave, and it actually runs straight down its throat. Again, they thought it was off by 3 degrees, but it's not. It actually works real well, just like the ancient barrows that are in Ireland and so on, Le Boyne Valley, and situations like that. Well, Stonehenge itself. In fact, to me, whenever I was looking at this, the blurb of the way the cave looks almost looks like Orion standing there. Isn't that weird? But so showing these correlations, they're telling you that cavemen way back over 30,000 years. Here's the idea of the Hall of Bulls that we were just looking at and how it gets shown on summer solstice. And because it has a 3-degree down rake, it's actually perfectly lined up, like it was selected. It wasn't like, wow, this is close enough or we can work with it, where some things are and so on, but different. And this gets carried through time to, like, here's Jericho Tower. So of the city of Jericho, 8,000 BC, predating anything that you try to connect with it with the Bible situation and so on, really. But this shaft that goes on here that you have to walk up, almost, the stairs are so steep you almost have to put your hands down and walk on your hands and knees, come up out of that tube. But that tube right there is exactly hooked up with the summer sunset solstice. Yep. And through a mountain path that goes here, it makes connections to it. And that ancient tower that's there, it's pretty cool. It's the very first tower that we know about that. And people a long time ago said, well, this is got to be a sacred site, it's got to be this. And other people said, this is like an archeoastronomy type thing. This is like the early astrologers. Well, is it the early astrologers? Or was it going on a couple of thousand years before this? Or apparently 30,000 years before this, and hooked up to Cro-Magnon man? That's what we're seeing here, and people are making papers and making connections. He even talks in this about how you can find ancient myths and they can target them back to a certain point. Other myths have a lot of correlations talking about certain animals and certain things happening in motifs, and if you'll recognize that it's where the zodiac's going around and animals that are attached to it, then we can attach that mythology to an ancient time. And sometimes with the idea of correlation, we can hook it up to much more. So here, this A pillar here showing you that there's that H block, which it looks like two people handing to each other, but it's got a sun encapsulated by a crescent moon, and that's an eclipse situation. Again, here's that fox that appears to be hooking up to the comet and the firefox. And then we end up having these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ducks, small baby ducks. Well, people have made correlations that that's the Pleiades. Quite often it's either 6 or 7 baby ducks or the 7 sisters and so on. In fact, here it is right here on my pointer on the Niebuhr sky disc that I did a video about a couple of years back, showing you that they've got this boat arc down here at the bottom hooked up to it. Whoops, that got in the way. And then here's the sun and the moon and the connective bars that go on the sides that connect to the solstices and so on too. Yeah, it's pretty cool hooking up, and he's hooking up all these ideas and go, well, here it is and here it is later, and this is a different representation that means the same thing. So all of his stuff on that is up for peer review, and he's making connections that that's the sun going through the constellations right whenever this thing happened at the Younger Dryas event. And so it's double confirmed itself now. And then this other hookups with the sun in its crescent. Some people have said that that one that the vulture's actually holding there might be the comet that comes down and breaks into us or whatever, but a lot of people said that's actually the snake right over here, because that connects to the idea of, well, the next pane down that we're looking at is the dead man. Constellation and animal